Good morning, page 468, on chapter 18, the Muses in GULag. It was an accepted saying that everything is possible in GULag. The blackest foulness, any twist and turn of betrayal, wildly unexpected encounters, love on the edge of the precipice, everything was possible. But if anybody should ever try to tell you with shining eyes that someone was re-educated by government means through the KVCH, the Cultural and Educational Section, you can reply with total conviction, nonsense. Everyone in GULag was re-educated under one another's influence and by circumstances, re-educated in various directions. But not even one juvenile, let alone any adult, was re-educated by means of the Cultural and Educational Section. However, so that our camps might not be like dens of depravity, communes of brigandage, nurseries of recidivists, and conductors of immorality, this is how Tsarist prisons were described. They were equipped with such an appendage as the Cultural and Educational Section, because, as was said by then head of GULag, Peter, quote, to the prison construction of capitalist countries, proletariat of the USSR counterposes its cultural construction. Those institutions in which the proletarian state enforces deprivation of freedom can be called prisons or by some other name. It is not a matter of terminology. These are places where life is not killed off, but instead gives forth new shoots. I don't know how Peter ended. There is a great likelihood, I think, that they soon wrung his neck too, in those very places in which, as he said, life gives off new shoots. But it is not a matter of terminology. Has the reader now understood what the main thing was in our camps? Cultural construction. And for every need, an organ was created and multiplied, and its tentacles reached out to every island. In the 1920s, they were called PVCH, Political and Educational Sections, and from the 1930s, Cultural and Educational Sections. They were supposed in part to replace the former prison priests and prison religious services. Here is how they were organized. The chief of the Cultural and Educational Section was a free employee with the authority of an assistant to the chief of camp. He picked out his own instructors. The norm was one instructor to 250 wards, who had to be from strata close to the proletariat, which meant, of course, that intellectuals, the petty bourgeoisie, were unsuitable, and it was more decent for them to be swinging a pick. So they recruited as instructors thieves with 2 or 3 convictions, urban swindlers, embezzlers, and seducers along with them. You can see that nowadays, right? Merit doesn't matter. And they're not even embarrassed to put criminals at the helm of their ships. Continuing. And so it was that a young fellow who had kept himself sort of clean and who had got 5 years for rape with mitigating circumstances might roll up his newspaper and go off to the barracks of the 58s to lead a little discussion on the role of labor in the process of correction. The instructors had a particularly good outside view of that role because they themselves have been released from the productive process. Such socially friendly elements made up the activists. The activist group of the Cultural and Educational Section. Remember, socially friendly elements, thieves, murderers, anybody who's not a political. But the activists were not released from work. They could only hope that in time they would be able to do in one of the instructors and take over his job. This created a generally friendly atmosphere in the cultural and educational section. In the mornings, the instructor had to see the Zeks off to work, and he would inspect the kitchen. He would be well fed, and he would go catch up on his sleep in his cabin. He would be ill-advised to tangle with or touch the thieves' ringleaders because, in the first place, it was dangerous, and in the second place, the moment would come when criminal cohesion would be transformed into a productive cohesion. And at that point, the thief ringleaders who led the shock brigades into storm assaults, and so, for the time being, let them to just sleep it off after their night-long card games. But the instructors are constantly guided in their activity by the general overall thesis that cultural and educational work in the camps is not cultural and educational work with unfortunates, but cultural and productive work with a knife edge. We just can't get along without a knife edge, without that knife edge. Directed against, yes, you've guessed it, against the 58s. Alas, the cultural and educational section does not have the right to arrest. Now this was such a limitation on its cultural opportunities, but could make a request to the administration, which would not refuse. And besides, the instructor systematically presents reports on the mood of the Zeks. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear. At this point, the cultural and educational section delicately shades into the security section, but this is not spelled out in the instructions. However, we see that, carried away by our quotations, we have grammatically slipped into the present tense. We have to disappoint the reader with the fact that the matter concerns the 30s, the finest, most flourishing years of the cultural and educational section, when a classless society was being built in the country, and when there had not yet occurred the awful outburst of class struggle that did occur the moment that society was achieved. In those glorious years, the cultural and educational section expanded into many important appendages, the cultural councils of those deprived of freedom, cultural and educational commissions, sanitary and living conditions commissions, shock brigade staffs, inspection posts for fulfillment of the production and financial plan, etc. Well, as Comrade Commission of the VT-ISK on particular amnesties said, even the prisoner in prison must live by what the whole country is living by. That foul enemy of the people, Solz, was justly punished by proletarian justice. I beg your pardon, that fighter for the great cause, Comrade Solz, was slandered and perished in the years of the cult. Oh, I beg your pardon, at the time of the insignificant phenomenon of the cult. And how variegated and varied were the forms of work, like life itself, organization of competition, organization of shock worker movements, struggle for fulfillment of the production and financial plan, struggle for labor discipline, storm assault on the liquidation of holdups, cultural crusades, voluntary collection of funds for airplanes, subscription to loans, voluntary Saturdays for strengthening the defense capabilities of the country, exposure of fake shock workers, conversations with malingerers, liquidation of illiteracy that went unwillingly, professional and technical courses for camp inmates from among the workers. The thieves pushed hard to learn to be drivers, freedom, and fascinating lectures on the inviolability of socialist property, and simply reading the newspapers aloud, evenings of questions and answers, the red corners in every barracks, graphs of fulfillment of plan, statistics on goals, and what posters, what slogans. In its happy time, the Muses soared over the gloomy expanses and chasms of the archipelago, and the first and highest muse among them was Polyhymnia, the muse of hymns and of slogans. The brigade that excels gets praise and respect. Do your shock work, get time off your sentence, or work hard, your family waits for you at home. You see how clever this is psychologically? After all, what do you have here? First, if you have forgotten about your family, this will start you worrying about them and reminds you of them. Second, if you are intensely alarmed, it will calm you down. Your family exists and has not been arrested. And in the third place, your family does not need you just for your own sake, but needs you only through conscientious camp work. Lastly, let's join in the shock assault and honor the 17th anniversary of the October Revolution. Who could resist that? Then there were theatricals with politically relevant themes, a little bit from Muse Thalia, for example, the servicing of the Red Calendar, or the Living Newspaper, or propaganda mock trials, or oratorios on the theme of the September plenum of the Central Committee of 1930, or a musical skit, the March of Baba Yaga, the March of the Articles of the Criminal Code. Article 58 was a lame Baba Yaga. How this all brightened the life of prisoners and helped them reach upward toward the light. And the recreation directors of the cultural and educational section. And then the artistic work too, the choirs and glee clubs under the shade of the Muse Euterpe. And then those propaganda brigades, shock workers swing their shoulders, hurrying with their wheelbarrows. You see what bold self-criticism this is. They were not even afraid to touch on the shock workers. In fact, it was quite enough for a propaganda brigade, image to the left here, number 39. It was quite enough for a propaganda brigade to come to a penalty sector and give a concert there. Listen, listen, River Volga. Night and day beside the decks. On the site stand the Chekists. What that means, never fear. The workers have a strong, strong arm. The OGPU men are communists. And all the penalty workers, and in particular the recidivists, would throw down their playing cards and rush off to work immediately. And there were other measures as well. A group of the best shock workers would visit the strict regimen company or a penalty isolator and take a propaganda brigade with them. For example, one like this in illustration 40, propaganda brigade. At the beginning, the shock workers would reproach and shame the malingerers, explain to them the advantages of fulfillment of the work norms. They would get better rations, and then the propaganda brigade would sing. Everywhere the battles call, and the Moscow-Volga Canal conquers snow and cold. And then with total frankness, and so that we'll live better, in order to eat, in order to drink, we have to dig the ground better. And they invited all volunteers not only to return to the compound, but to transfer immediately into shock workers' barracks from the penalty barracks, where they would have been fed right on the spot. Excuse me. What an artistic success! The propaganda brigades, except for the central one, were not released from work themselves. They got an extra portion of grits on the days of their performances. And what about more delicate types of work? For example, the struggle with the aid of the prisoners themselves against equalizing wages. You just have to ponder what a profound thought is contained here. This means that at a brigade meeting, a prisoner would stand up and say, Don't give him a full ration. He worked badly. You'd do better to give the 7 ounces to me instead. Or the comrades' courts. In the first years after the revolution, these were called moral comrades, and they embraced the games of chance, fights, thefts. But were these really a business for the court? And the word moral smelled to high heaven of bourgeois morality, and it was abrogated. From the period of Reconstruction from 1928, these courts began to deal with absenteeism, with simulating illness, a poor attitude toward inventory, spoiled production, spoilage of materials, and so long as hostile class elements among the prisoners did not worm their way into the comrades' courts, and only murderers, thieves, converted to bitches, embezzlers, and bribe takers appeared there, the courts in their sentencing would petition the camp chief for such penalties as deprivation of visits, food parcels, time off sentence, release of parole, and the dispatch of incorrigibles on prisoner transports. What reasonable, fair measures these were, and how particularly useful it was that the initiative in implying them came from the camp prisoners themselves, though not, of course, without certain difficulties. They commenced the trial of former kulak in comrade's court, and he said, quote, "You have a comrade's court, and to you I'm a kulak, not a comrade, so you have no right to judge me," unquote. They were thrown into confusion. They consulted the political education section of the chief administration of corrective labor camps, received the reply, try him, don't fool around." What was the foundation of foundations of all the cultural and educational work in camp? Don't leave the camp inmate to himself after work, so he will not revert to his former criminal tendencies. Well, for example, so that the 58s wouldn't start thinking about politics. It was important that the prisoners should never get out from under the educational influences. And in this regard, advanced modern technical devices were very helpful, and in particular the loudspeakers on every pillar and in every barracks. They must never fall silent. They must explain to the prisoners constantly and systematically, from reveille until taps, how to advance the hour of freedom. They reported every hour on the course of the work, on the leading and lagging of work brigades, on those who were hindering, and one who could recommend another original format of conversation on the radio with individual malinkers and slackers. Well, and there was the press, of course, the press, the sharpest weapon of our party. Now this was real proof that in our country there was freedom of the press, the existence of press in prisons. Yes, in what other country was it still possible for prisoners to have their own press? First, there were handwritten wall newspapers, and second, mimeographed and printed ones, and in both cases they had fearless camp correspondents who scourged faults of the prisoners, and this self-criticism was encouraged by the leadership. The extent to which the leadership itself attributed significance to the free camp press is indicated even by Order 434 to GULag. The overwhelming majority of the criticism aroused no response. The newspapers also published photos of the shock workers. The newspapers pointed the finger. The newspapers disclosed. The newspapers also exposed the sallies of the class enemy, so he could be hit harder. The newspapers was the best collaborator of the security section, and overall the newspapers reflected the flow of camp life and are invaluable testimony for descendants. Here, for example, is the newspaper of the Archangel prison in 1931. It depicts for us the bounty of prosperity in which the prisoners were living. Cuspidors, ashtray, oilcloth on the tables, radio loudspeakers, portraits of the leaders, and slogans on the walls speak vividly of the general party line. These are the well-earned fruits of those deprived of freedom enjoy. Which those deprived of freedom enjoy. Yes, dear fruits. And how did this affect the lives of those deprived of freedom? The same paper half a year later. Everyone had set to work energetically. The fulfillment of the production of financial plan has risen. The food has decreased and worsened. Well, that's all right. That, as it happens, is all right. The last element could be corrected. And where, oh where, has all that gone? And how transitory everything beautiful and perfect is on earth. Such an intensive, hearty, optimistic system of education of the merry-go-round type, flowing from the very sources of the progressive teaching, promising that within a few years, not one single criminal would be left in our country. On November 30th, 1934, it particularly seemed like that. And where then? All of a sudden, the Ice Age set in, which of course was necessary and absolutely indispensable, and all the petals of those tender beginnings were scattered to the winds. And where did the shock worker movement and socialist competition disappear to? And the camp newspapers? Storm assaults, collection of funds, subscription to loans, and unpaid Saturdays. Cultural councils and comrades' courts, literacy drives, and technical courses. What did it matter when they even issued orders that the portraits of the party leaders and the loudspeakers should be removed from the camp compounds? And they didn't go putting any more cuspidors around either. And how the life of prisoners suddenly paled, how it was suddenly thrown back whole decades deprived of the most important revolutionary prison gains. But we are not protesting. The measures of the party were both timely and very much needed. No longer was the artistic, poetical forms of slogans valued, and the slogans too were now only the simplest: fulfill, over-fulfill. Of course, no one undertook to forbid directly aesthetic indoctrination or the fluttering of the Muses, but the possibilities for this was greatly narrowed. Here, for example, it's one of the camp compounds in Vorkuta. The 9-month winter came to an end, and the unreal 3-month-long, somehow pitiful summer set in. The chief of the cultural and educational section was pained because the camp compound looked foul and dirty. In such conditions, a criminal could not properly meditate on the perfection of the system from which he had excluded himself. So the cultural and educational section proclaimed several working Sundays. In their free time, the prisoners took great pleasure in making some flower beds, not out of anything growing, for nothing would grow there, but instead of planting flowers, they just decorated dead mounds skillfully with mosses, lichens, broken glass, crushed stone, slag, and broken up brick. And then around these flower beds they set up little fences made of plaster's lath. Though it turned out not to be quite so beautiful as the Gorky Park, nonetheless the cultural and educational section was satisfied. Were you going to say that in 2 months' time the rains would fall and wash it all away? Well, so what? They would wash it away. Next year we will do it all over again. Or what did the political chats turn into? A lecturer came to GULag, number 5 from Ch18 in 1952. After work, the Czechs were herded to the lecture. The comrades, it is true, had no secondary education, but he delivered a necessary and topical lecture, which was fully correct politically, on the struggle of the Greek patriots. The Czechs sat there sleepily hiding behind each other's backs without the slightest interest in it. The lecturer described the awful persecutions of the patriots and related how the Greek women in tears had to write a letter to Comrade Stalin. The lecture came to an end, and Sharonetta, a woman from Laval, who was simple-minded but cunning, rose and asked, "Citizen Chief, tell me, who should we write to?" And by this, the positive influence of the lecture was reduced to zero. Hey, baby. The types of correctional and educational work which the cultural and educational section retained were these: to a prisoner's petition to the camp chief, they would add a notation of norm fulfillment and conduct. They would deliver to the various rooms letters released by the censor. They would bind newspapers in a file and hide them from the Czechs so they couldn't use them for cigarette paper. 3 times a year they gave amateur theatrical programs. They procured paints and canvas for artists so the latter could provide decorations for the camp compound and paint paintings for the chief's apartments, and then they would help the security chief a bit, but that was unofficial. After this, it is not surprising that the workers of the cultural and educational section themselves were not flaming bold leaders, but for the most part, dimwits and sad sacks. Yes, there was one more important type of work which they did, maintaining the boxes. They had to be opened at intervals, cleaned out and locked up again. Small brownish-colored boxes hung in prominent place in the compound. On the boxes were labels to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, to the Council of Ministers in the USSR, to the Minister of Internal Affairs, to the Prosecutor General. Go ahead and write. You have freedom of speech here, and we will decide what goes to whom. There are special comrades here to read it. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.